I'm Evan Smith, the CEO of the Texas Tribune, and I want to welcome you to the Future of Higher Education, the Tribune's latest, greatest virtual event. This ambitious week-long symposium is asking and answering a question critical to the well-being of Texas now and going forward. How are our public universities, private colleges, community colleges, and the like doing at achieving the various elements of their mission, including principally educating the next generation, building workforce, and setting the table of opportunity for all? All week long, we're talking about higher ed generally, but with a special focus on the impact of the coronavirus pandemic on all of the above. How these unprecedented months of disruption change the trajectory for students and families and this great state. Today, we have two more important conversations. The Tribune's brand new higher education reporter, Kate McGee, joins us for a live Q&A moderated by our news editor, Rebecca Allen. But first, executive editor Ross Ramsey will be sitting down with the state's Commissioner of Higher Education and the chair of the House Higher Education Committee to discuss the higher ed policy agenda in the 87th legislative session. Before we begin, I want to thank our symposium's sponsors, the Trellis Foundation, Bank of America, Texas 2036, the McCombs School of Business at the University of Texas at Austin, the Texas Association of Community Colleges, the University of Arizona, Educate Texas, Philanthropy Advocates, the Greater Texas Foundation, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, Raise Your Hand Texas, Texas State Technical College, and the Texas State University System. Thanks as well to our media partner, the 74 Million. If you'd like to join the online conversation, tweet using the hashtag TT Events. And now I'll turn it over to my colleague, Ross Ramsey, to get us started.
Hi, I'm Ross Ramsey from the Texas Tribune. Thanks for joining us for our symposium on the future of higher education. My guests today are Harrison Keller, who is the Texas Commissioner of Higher Education and has been since 2019. Previously, he was a clinical professor of public policy practice at the University of Texas at Austin. And Chris Turner, a representative in the Texas House who's been serving House District 101 since 2013. He currently serves as chair of the House Higher Education Committee and chair of the House Democratic Caucus. Let's just jump in and get started. This will be relatively quick. I guess the first thing I wanted to ask you we're going into a legislative session that looks a little bit like a slog on the budget, not necessarily what either one of you might have been expecting when you were thinking about this, I don't know, last January or February. Commissioner, you want to start off with this? What were you looking for, and now what are you looking for? How has it changed?
Originally, as you mentioned, Ross, I when I became commissioner about a year ago, it was a very different kind of environment, and we were looking forward to a higher education session to complement some of the work that had been done in public education on House Bill 3. So at the time, the economy was very strong. The budget prospects looked very good. And so in particular, we were having a lot of conversations about what a higher education finance bill might look like that would mirror some of the kinds of advances that House Bill 3 made in terms of more equity for school districts and overall increased investment. So on the higher education finance side, we'd never really recovered on the per student funding from where we were coming out of the Great Recession. So there'd been some investments in higher education along the way that the legislature had made, but they prioritized public school finance, and that culminated in House Bill 3. And then the idea was, well, in 2021, that'll be the higher ed session where we'll modernize the higher ed finance system. Well, then the rug sort of got pulled out from under us last March. And so now some of the things that we were looking forward to working on have, I would argue, become even more urgent because we've got more than 3.6 million Texans who filed for unemployment since last March. And a lot of those jobs are not coming back or are not coming back quickly. And so that means that we have hundreds of thousands of Texans who are going to need to reskill and upskill to get back on their feet, get back into the workforce, help drive the Texas recovery. So that's going to be the primary focus of our higher ed finance conversations among the institutions, and I think with the policymakers, because I can attest that even though we have certainly seen historic costs to our higher ed institutions, that across the board, I think they understand that higher ed has an important role and responsibility to play in driving economic recovery.
Chairman Turner, from the legislative side, were you expecting kind of the same thing? Were you I guess I want to see if back before all of this you were of like minds and where you are now.
Sure. Well, I agree with what Dr. Keller said. I think that prior to the pandemic, we were looking at a lot of work on higher education next session. I mean, I'll be the first to say that I think every session should be a higher education session, but obviously the focus can be more intense some sessions as opposed to others. What I think looking ahead to this session, what we are facing a lot of challenges, as your question describes accurately. And we're just in the current biennium, for instance, it's estimated we'll have a $4.6 billion budget shortfall. That's based on Comptroller Hager's revised revenue estimate, which is really a total swing of over $11 billion for this current biennium. That's to say nothing of the next biennium. And we don't know what those numbers are yet, but they're probably not going to be great. And so I think that we ought to start out with a couple of guideposts. When I said we, I mean the legislature and other policymakers, and that education is the key to strengthening and rebuilding our economy and growing our economy for the future. And that means we can't backslide on public education funding and the progress made on House Bill 3 that Dr. Keller just described. But it also means we can't look to higher education as a place to go make up for revenue. And in the past, that has been what happened. As Dr. Keller said, in 2011, there were budget cuts that adversely impacted higher education. We've never fully recovered from those. We can't repeat that same mistake again. Higher education plays a vital role to play in leading Texas out of this economic and healthcare catastrophe that we've experienced this year. And that means they need the resources to do it. We need to be smart how we spend resources and be careful with taxpayer funds. But we need to invest in higher education because it's a good investment for Texas.
How much of what you guys were trying to do or were thinking about doing can be done without money? I'm curious how much of this was structural. You just want to refigure the way the formulas work, or you want to concentrate on different areas, and how much of it was really what this needs is more money, it's less structural. Commissioner, you want to try that?
Yeah, so some of the conversations that we were having were the kinds of things that don't require a lot of additional funding. So for example, we've been with our 60 by 30 Texas higher education goals for a few years now. And already before the pandemic hit us, we were already talking about that it might be time for us to revisit those goals. So there are a few places that they don't quite pick up the needs of our workforce and our current economy. So for example, like the central goal of 60 by 30 is really focused on that young working population, the age 25 to 34. And the big goal is to have 60% of that population have some kind of post-secondary credential by 2030. Well, that's certainly an important goal, but we have a lot of folks who are older than 34 who are going to need to reskill and upskill to be able to participate in and contribute to the Texas economy. We were already seeing those changes and those needs before COVID hit us. And so now what's happened is the pandemic's actually accelerated some of those changes that were already underway in the economy. So if anything, then this need to revisit, refine, sort of recommit ourselves to our higher ed goals has become even more urgent. That's not so much about new money up front. It's about getting a clear idea of what our focus needs to be. What are those credentials that are going to drive opportunities for individuals, for our communities, and long-term competitiveness for the state. But as Chairman mentions rightly, then we need to make sure that our policy is aligned with our higher education goals, and the way that we are supporting our institutions, the way we're holding them accountable, and the way we're funding them needs to align with and advance our state higher education goals.
You alluded a moment ago about how the pandemic and the current situation has changed some of the things in higher ed. Maybe this is a time for more focus. What's different that you're presenting to the legislature and saying, we never thought of this before, but we've got to do blank, and it's going to cost, X amount of money?
So a couple of things I'd point to. One is that when we were talking about the need to reskill and upskill before the pandemic hit us, and we'd already launched some of that work, there's an initiative at the agency called GradTex that we'd rebooted in partnership with the Greater Houston Partnership and higher ed institutions in the Greater Houston area. And that rebooting and that conversation happened in a context where we had about 4% unemployment. So that's a very different context where you're talking about, well, how are we going to engage folks and convince them that they need to sort of complete those degrees or add additional skills so they can be competitive for the long term. Of course, now we have a lot of folks who are going to need to reskill and upskill just to get back into the workforce, get back on their feet. So the reskilling and upskilling conversation is even more urgent than it was a few months ago. The other thing that I'd point to where there might be some silver lining is around sort of innovation and how we deliver higher education. So if we were having this conversation like, say, last February, and you asked whether hypothetically it might be possible for all of our colleges and universities to put almost all their courses online in the space of about 2 weeks, we would all laugh about that. And then it turns out that's exactly what happened at the end of March. And so we've seen institutions leveraging technology, changing their schedules, rethinking the way they use physical spaces at a pace that none of us have experienced in our lifetime. So this has been the most dramatic disruption to the operation of our colleges and universities since the end of the Second World War. And one of the things that is a silver lining is that it has accelerated innovation about how we use technology and how we're and I would say also and who we're able to serve through our institutions.
Mr. Chairman, one of the problems the legislature has right now is that you can't get in the same building. So I know the answer to this next question is going to be based on your phone conversations instead of the people you've been talking to at committee meetings and things. But how are lawmakers thinking about higher education now? And has the pandemic and the recession and this whole experience of the last 7 or 8 months changed what their priorities are, how they're thinking about it, and what they want to do when they come back in January?
Yeah, well, and you're right. The legislature has certainly been inhibited by physical lack of physical access to the Capitol and inability to hold committee hearings. But a lot of conversations have continued happening in other ways. And I should add the House Higher Education Committee is completing its interim work through the request for information system, and appreciate all the institutions who've helped with that. And so I hope we'll be able to focus the legislature on higher ed priorities. I think that people generally have a good understanding of the value that higher education provides at all times, but particularly in an economic downturn like we're in now, where jobs have disappeared and are in some cases unfortunately won't come back. That we need to have plentiful opportunities for Texans to go back to school or continue through school or have new pathways into school if they're coming into college, whatever the case may be. But we need to make sure educational opportunities are available so that Texans achieve the level of education, whether it's an associate's degree or bachelor's degree or a certification. To be able to take on a job in this evolving economy, and to pick up on the last question, I think some of that involves money. Not every reform does involve money, however, or maybe doesn't involve a lot of money. And Dr. Keller touched on some of those. I would add also, Senator Royce West and I worked a lot last session on a key transferability bill. We know one of the challenges in higher education is that students have a lot of stranded hours where they take classes at maybe a community college, maybe at a four-year school, but then transfer to another four-year school. And then those credits don't come with them, or they do, but they don't count towards their degree. That's a real problem. It costs students time and money. It costs the state money. And we need to improve some of those things. So I want to see how that bill is being implemented and see how we can build on it and improve upon it. Additionally, I passed a bill on open educational resources to create a OER repository for the state. This basically is an alternative to students having to buy costly textbooks and other materials. And again, that if it works, we'll save students money. And the more we save money, the more it helps students complete college. So those are things that the legislature needs to continue to work on outside of perhaps the appropriations process that can make college education more accessible for more Texans.
Tell me a little bit about the appropriations process this time. Appropriations bills are always, a little bit of an elimination game where this part of the budget's competing against that part of the budget. We've got a recession, as you pointed out. The controller has been fairly pessimistic about the money coming in for the current biennium, probably will be for the next biennium. And you get into these inevitable conversations about, well, if we do this over here, then we have to stop doing that over there. How do you keep higher ed? What's the argument for keeping higher ed sort of out of the elimination game, or limiting its exposure? Either one of you can jump at that.
Sure. Well, I'll take a first swing at it. I think it's a couple of things. I think on the one hand, higher education and its advocates and stakeholders have to continuously make the case as to why higher education is such a valuable investment for the state of Texas, and how there is such a great return on that investment when we invest those dollars. And that's what, and Commissioner Keller and I have had these conversations. That's what we, I think both are trying to do, and others are trying to do, is continually highlight the good work going on in higher education, whether it's converting all your classes to all virtual in a matter of 2 weeks last March, or whether it's the cutting edge healthcare research and clinical healthcare delivery that our institutions of higher ed are delivering around the state in our great healthcare institutions, and a lot of other examples too. So that's part of it, is just making that case. But secondly, and this pertains to the overall budget, not just higher education, the legislature is going to have to figure out how we're going to pay for our priorities. And we know from just the last session, even when we were flush with cash, that House Bill 3, the public education bill, was not paid for in the out years. We were fine for this biennium, or we were till the pandemic, but it wasn't paid for in the out years. And that's why some of my Republican colleagues wanted to increase the sales tax. Thought that was the wrong approach. We shouldn't raise that tax. But there are a lot of tax loopholes and credits out there, some of which are outdated. I think the legislature needs to take a sunset review process to that and say, which of these do we still need? Which of these can we do without? Additionally, we need to expand Medicaid under the Affordable Care Act, which would bring in close to $10 billion a year in federal funding, which would relieve pressure on the healthcare side of our budget and also have an economic stimulative effect on the economy. And then there's other options out there. People are looking at, is there some modest expansion of gambling that might be something the legislature would consider. So there's a lot of ideas. I think we need to get creative and figure out how we're going to meet our priorities. But simply cutting education isn't going to serve our state well.
Mm-hmm. So if I could just underline a couple of points that the chairman just made. I mean, I would say higher education is one of the ways that we're going to get through this crisis. So I do think it's important to underline the ways that we're dependent on the research and development mission, to discover new treatments for vaccine research, even for engineering respirators and PPE. I think our higher ed institutions, community colleges, as well as regional universities and our research universities and health science centers really ought to be commended. And I think their role in that public health response has really not been recognized to the extent it ought to be. But then the other thing is that we've got folks who are going to need to reskill and upskill and stay on track so that we're going to have the kind of workforce we need for Texas to be competitive. And so historically what's happened is when budgets get tight in states across the country, the states pull back their investments in higher education, and that means tuition goes up, and that slows down enrollment, and it means student debt goes up. Well, in the kind of situation we're in, that would actually slow down the recovery of the Texas economy. So smart strategic investments in higher education can actually help accelerate the recovery, help us get through this faster, and help our state get back on our feet more quickly.
The legislature is coming back in 3 months, so it may be too short a fuse for this conversation, but there's been a lot of talk during the pandemic about reimagining both public education and higher education. Maybe these things aren't going to work the same way that they used to. Maybe we're going to do more things like what we're doing right now, talking to people in little boxes. And I'm wondering, as you go into this legislative session, how much of that reimagining of higher education is really part of the planning here, or is that something that you get to maybe a little bit later on? Right now, you're just taking care of immediate problems. Commissioner, you want to handle that first?
Yeah, so we're at the front edge of a revolution in how we deliver higher education. And so to answer your question, it's not something that we can put off. It's something that's underway right now. And one of the reasons is out of necessity, as the institutions have had to adjust the ways they've delivered higher ed. But also, I would say because of policy decisions that have been made in the last session and the last couple of sessions, and also in the last few months. So for example, so the governor, lieutenant governor, speaker, and the bipartisan leadership of both House Appropriations and Senate Finance came together and allocated $175 million of CARES Act funding to higher education. And the bulk of that funding was for financial aid, to make sure that our financial aid programs wouldn't be cut because of the kinds of implications of COVID on the state budget that Chairman talked about. But in addition, there was another $46.5 million in additional emergency aid that they allocated through our agency, and we were able to get out to our institutions this fall. And then we just released a request for applications for another $46.5 million that's specifically targeted at reskilling and upskilling for displaced workers, and also re-enrolling folks with some college but no credential. There was another $10 million that was allocated for improving the quality of digital teaching and learning. And so we're able to leverage that infrastructure that the chairman and his colleagues had the foresight to put in place. So now we're putting out millions of dollars of grants to get behind our innovators in colleges and universities across the state, so we can develop and implement better resources to improve the quality of that teaching and learning experience. And then there was another $15 million that was allocated to improve our educational and workforce data infrastructure. So we're working in partnership with the legislature, with the governor's office, with the Workforce Commission, but especially with the institutions and economic development organizations to say, how do we bring the Texas data to bear in a way that gives us more real-time, more actionable intelligence about what the needs are, so we can focus our resources more appropriately, make sure that we're getting that value that the chairman talked about over time. So we have not at all taken our foot off the gas pedal. And I will, again, commend the institutions that I think, I spent a lot of time talking to college and university presidents, and I think even though all of them, they're dealing with enormous challenges and costs, I think they all recognize that this is a time where they've got a special role and responsibility for their institutions to step up and help drive the recovery. And a big part of that's going to be innovating the future of higher education.
Mr. Chairman, are there some things that the legislature might have kind of had on their plate in February as they went into this session? I want higher ed to do this thing and this thing and this thing, that maybe have shifted some. I was talking to another legislator the other day about a public education issue. It's also a higher education issue. It's also really a workforce issue, and it's high-speed broadband. And it's been such a hard sell in the legislature for a long time, and wasn't really an infrastructure issue until, I don't know, March 16th or so. And now it's a real issue. So it's a thing that wasn't necessarily on the front burner that is now. When you think about higher education, are there some things the legislature was thinking about then that maybe have been pushed back, and some things that maybe it wasn't thinking about or you weren't thinking about back at the beginning of the year that have now come to the front burner?
Sure. Well, I think that I would agree with the sentiment on broadband. I think that this pandemic, unfortunately, has exposed a lot of gaps and weaknesses in our society, overall, whether it's in healthcare, or the economy, or infrastructure, and broadband access clearly is an acute issue for many Texans, both in rural areas and also in urban and suburban areas, like where I live. And we know that it is virtually impossible for someone to conduct business either as a student or as an employee in many cases if they don't have access to broadband in most times, but especially in this time that we're in now. And so I do think that broadband is a good example of where there could be good bipartisan support and urban and rural support to do something meaningful. One issue that we haven't touched on that I'd like to bring up, it's related, is, I think before the pandemic, leading into this session, there was some growing agreement that we needed to pass a tuition revenue bond bill in this next, and kind of in keeping with the higher ed session theme. And of course, 2 years ago in 2019, I passed the bill through the House with broad bipartisan support, but it didn't make it out of the Senate. And so we thought we had some momentum going into this next session. I would argue that while some may say, well, because of the pandemic and economic challenges, that may have to wait, I would argue the exact opposite. This is the time to double down on something like TRBs, which is our primary method of financing capital construction at four-year schools in Texas. This is the exact time to do it. Long-term debt is as cheap as it's ever going to be right now because interest rates are so low. Plus, it provides a tremendous economic stimulus if we can create all these construction projects around the state, with a $3 to $4 billion construction package. Moreover, the pandemic has taught us that in addition to the need to replace outdated facilities, which has long existed, and our schools pay a lot in deferred maintenance, that's not a good use of taxpayer funds or public funds. But the pandemic has also taught us the need to reimagine how some of these spaces work and to make them more compatible to a new way of learning. And so this is the time, I believe, is right to move forward with a TRB bill. And I would encourage my colleagues to doubly look at that in this legislative session, because I think it would be a great thing for the state.
Commissioner, we've just got less than a minute left, but do you have some things on your plate that might not necessarily have been there before that you want the legislature to consider?
Well, I would say that this has really accelerated and amplified the need for us to make these kind of smart strategic investments in higher education, make sure that, we're really enabling higher education to play this role in helping to drive the Texas recovery. My hope is that we look back on this time as a watershed moment when we started focusing on broader opportunities and programs for Texans across the spectrum, regardless of their background, their geography, their ethnicity, so that they could participate in and benefit from the great state of Texas. And so, higher education, I think, is one of the most important investments right now. And I look forward to working with the legislature so that, we can make sure that we're able to play that role.
Okay, great. With that, we're out of time. I'd like to thank everybody for tuning in. I'd like to thank Harrison Keller, the Commissioner of Higher Education of Texas, Chris Turner, Chairman of the House Higher Education Committee. Thank you both. Stay safe.
Thank you. Enjoyed it.
Thank you.